This week's WandaVision had answers that led to questions and questions that led to answers, so let's answer your questions and question our answers right now. Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell here with my review of the penultimate episode of WandaVision, episode 8, which was entitled Previously On. I guess we're at a point now where they trust us with the titles before the show premieres. There was a lot to go through, and as we've been doing since the very beginning, pretty much of these reviews, not a whole lot of spoiler-free thoughts to talk about. So this is your blanket spoiler warning. This is a spoiler review, breakdown, whatever you want to call it, of last night's episode, or I should say this morning's episode of WandaVision. So if you haven't watched it, tune out now, come back after you've seen it, because there is definitely a lot to talk about. WandaVision has had some emotional moments thus far, but this one really just almost from the very beginning was going right for the heart or the gut or whatever you want to call it, including on the previously on WandaVision, where we see it's still painful, even just a few years later, Vision's double death, first at the hands of Wanda, then at the hands of Thanos, and there wasn't a whole lot of setup to any of the stuff that had happened before this episode as far as the WandaVision plot goes. It was pretty much Vision's death, here's Agatha, let's go. So you knew that this wasn't going to go deep into the lore necessarily of a lot of the other characters of the show. It looks like that's going to be happening next week. We do open briefly though in Salem, Massachusetts in 1693, and we see that Agatha Harkness has been doing this witch thing for hundreds of years. I guess that's not too surprising, but I like the little bait and switch they pull where they're marching her out and to the stake, and you think, oh, it's the Salem witch trials. No, as a matter of fact, she's kind of being put on trial by her fellow witches for overstepping those boundaries. They say that she's been using the darkest of magic that's forbidden even to other witches, and Agatha's kind of saying like, hey, I'm a good witch. What do you want me to do? The magic was bending to my will, not the opposite, but they just didn't want to hear it. This ends with Agatha wiping out her entire coven of witches, including her mom. That is harsh. What this does, though, is set the stakes for Agatha, especially because we didn't get the Agatha all along reveal until the very end of the last episode, and we kind of need to understand what her motivations are to set up what she's doing in this episode. So I like the fact that we have this flashback where we're establishing basically that she's a very powerful witch, that she is very curious about magic, she doesn't have a whole lot of limits to magic, and she wants that power. She loves finding these new kinds of magic, which we find out is really what drove her to Westview and to find Wanda in the first place. I also like that when it came up 1693 that so many of the people that keep like a running supercut of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in chronological order, you got to scrub back almost to the beginning of your timeline. I mean, we got maybe a couple things from Thor and a few other things, but this is chronologically one of the earliest scenes in the canon MCU that we've gotten so far. Then we pick up basically exactly where the episode last week left off. We're back in Westview. We're in Agnes's creepy basement. Wanda asks where her kids are. Then we see Wanda try to use her powers, and Agatha explains that she can't because those symbols that we glimpsed last week on the walls are actually runes that basically say this is a magical place to Agatha and Agatha only, so no other magic can be used here. But the fact that Wanda's powers don't work in Agatha's magical place should have been my first clue that we're going to get some big reveals about the nature and the origins of Wanda's powers. I didn't catch on until later on in the episode, but this is an early peek because you would think that if her powers were solely derived from an Infinity Stone, that magic wouldn't necessarily be the thing that dictates whether she can or can't do anything with her abilities. This is Agatha's world, and before we go into Wanda's past, she does drop a few little tidbits and a couple things that I'm curious to revisit as we go into the season finale next week. The first one being Pietro, fake Pietro, or as she calls him, Fietro, is not it appears the corporeal Quicksilver from the Fox X-Men timeline. Agatha describes him as a crystalline projection because she could not actually reanimate Pietro's body. It was in a completely different part of the world, a different part of the continent. Instead, this is more of a representation of Agatha. She says it's her eyes and ears. So it does appear that the Pietro that we have seen that Evan Peters is playing is a 100% creation from Agatha. It is not something pulled over from another part of the multiverse. My initial response to this is I'm not going to say disappointed because I think there's still more to say on this, but they really did swerve us here because if you go back to that episode where they first did the reveal, I mean, I was jumping out of my chair because I thought this was such a great way to introduce the concept of the multiverse. Now, knowing that this is a projection of Agatha's, it closes that door again. The door that I thought was open is now closed. It's definitely high marks on keeping me guessing about what's going on. But if the reveal is that he doesn't really have anything to do with that Quicksilver, I'm going to be a little disappointed, I'm going to be honest. But I'm not there yet because, like I said, we've got a whole other week's worth of show left. There's still perhaps more to reveal when it comes to where this projection of Pietro at least came from in Agatha's mind. We also get what looks like a definitive answer on the origins of Westview. When the Agatha all along thing was brought in, there were some questions, especially in my mind, about, okay, well, did she have some say in how this was all created? Did she somehow spur Wanda to do this? But it turns out that the answer is no. Wanda did create Westview herself, and it was this creation, this huge use of magic, that attracted Agatha to come into Westview. She didn't create it. She didn't have a hand in creating it. She just became an agent of chaos inside Westview once Wanda had already made this world for herself. We also find out Agatha's motivations for mixing herself up in Wanda's life like this, which is basically, I would have to call it professional jealousy. Agatha has been a witch for hundreds of years, as we've established at the beginning of this episode, and she sees this person, Wanda, who's able to do this magic that she has been trying to do for centuries. All of these things that she's worked so hard to achieve for her entire life, it seems Wanda can do at ease. And she wants to know the answer. She wants to know how it was done. And I think it's going to be very interesting to go back and look at the show, especially knowing that Pietro is a manifestation of the eyes and ears of Agatha. That carnival scene in the Halloween episode when Pietro's kind of like, how'd you do this, sis? The idea that Agatha's been poking and prodding and trying to figure out these answers, and finally she's just going direct to the source. And because Wanda is essentially powerless in this world that Agatha has created with the runes, etc., in her basement, Agatha decides that she's going to take these memories out of Wanda's head. She takes a strand of her hair and creates a universe where she can go into Wanda's past and essentially pull out this information from her. Where did this pain come from? Where did this grief come from? And most importantly, how did she create Westview? The first stop on the tragical mystery tour of Wanda's very, very sad life, just objectively depressing life, we go to Sokovia, where we meet Wanda's parents. We see young Wanda, young Pietro. We've heard this story before. We've heard what happened to their parents and why she hated Tony Stark so much and allowed herself to be subjected to the experiments that we thought gave her her powers. But this is the first time we're actually seeing this family unit in action. And it also establishes the form of this show and why Wanda is so in love with these different sitcoms. And it's that one of the things that her dad did to make money was to take DVDs of these American shows out and try to sell them. And the ones that he didn't sell, he would bring home and they would all watch together as a family because they enjoyed them, but also as a tool to help them learn English. And so we see I Love Lucy and we see Malcolm in the Middle. And we also see that little Wanda's favorite show is not just the Dick Van Dyke Show, which they were heavily influenced by in the first couple episodes of this show, but one particular episode, which is called It May Look Like a Walnut. And I've talked about the fact that I don't know the background of a lot of things on this show, but this is one that I do because I was a big Nick at Night fan growing up, and they used to have a TV countdown every year on New Year's Eve where they would count down like the top 50 or 100 best episodes of all the different shows that they watched. And It May Look Like a Walnut from the Dick Van Dyke Show was always near the top of that list. It's a really, really funny episode. Basically, Dick Van Dyke's character, Rob, is watching a sci-fi TV show on television, and he falls asleep and wakes up the next morning, and he starts thinking that everyone around him has been replaced by aliens. They leave these walnuts, which are supposedly irradiate human beings and turn them into aliens with 4 eyes, and their thumbs disappear, and all of a sudden, Rob thinks that his wife is an alien, and he thinks that his co-workers are aliens, and it's basically a protracted nightmare, but it's also one of the best and funniest episodes of the show.
Laura! Darling! What are you doing home from work so early?
thematically, I think it really works well with WandaVision as well, because it's the idea of a false reality, the idea that this is all just a bad dream, or that somehow the fabric of reality is going to collapse and you're going to wake up from this nightmare, but also the idea of being replaced. And we find out more about Vision, that not everyone in this town is actually who they are, who Wanda thinks that they are. So there are some definite tie-ins to this beyond just being a reference to the Dick Van Dyke Show. Then the thing that I think most of us saw coming happens, which is that we see the fighting outside. There's a bomb that explodes suddenly in the building. It kills Wanda and Pietro's parents. And then the Stark Industries, the famous/infamous Stark Industries bomb, crashes into the apartment. And we'd heard this story about how Wanda and Pietro were in the apartment. They were trapped there for 2 days waiting for that bomb to go off, and it never went off. It was a defective bomb. But we now get a little bit more information, and this is the first time that Agatha drops some hints that there's more going on with Wanda, that maybe she wasn't just an average person before all this experimentation with Hydra, because she suggests that Wanda may have reached out with some magic powers that were already existing inside of her with a probability hex, and basically kept that bomb from going off. That the reason the bomb didn't go off wasn't because it was defective or faulty, but because Wanda subconsciously somehow used existing magical powers to keep it from going off. That's a very interesting concept, and I certainly kind of sat up a little bit and raised my eyebrows and went, what are they aiming at? Could we be looking at, are they trying to open the door to mutants? Like, what are they doing? Because if you're suggesting that she had some kind of pre-existing power, then we could be going to some very interesting places. Then we go to the Hydra lab, where Wanda was imbued with the powers that we've seen her manifest in all of the different MCU movies and TV shows, etc. And we hear that none of the test subjects have survived direct contact with the Mind Stone, which is the Infinity Stone that gave Wanda her powers. So we're also establishing again this idea that Wanda had some kind of pre-existing unique thing about her that allowed her to take all of this stuff from the Mind Stone to stay alive and to become a superhero, a super-powered being. We see this explosion of energy that bathes Wanda in this yellow light, and then we see a very interesting vision. There's really no other word for it. That looks like, and I've gotten into costume trouble before, but I will say I feel pretty confident in saying that the vision that Wanda sees is the old school Scarlet Witch costume, the pointed mask, etc. It's the version of the costume that we saw her wear, kind of a Halloween version of, in the Halloween episode. We then see her in isolation, and again, at a key point in her life, she is watching a sitcom. This is an episode of The Brady Bunch, and I will say, I grew up watching The Brady Bunch after school on TV, so this was another episode, strangely, that I remembered, and it's one that does have loose connections to a lot of the themes of this episode, because it's an earlier episode of the show. Cindy has a doll, and Bobby, both the youngest of the family, has a kazoo, and both of those items go missing. They accuse each other of stealing it, and then at the end it's revealed that the dog was the one who stole both of those toys all along. And I think that ties in very closely to what we find out about Vision and Hayward later on in this episode. The idea of being accused of stealing something and then finding out later that it was somebody else who did it. Some very interesting things to not just put sitcom episodes in the show, but to choose particular episodes that have thematic resonance with what's already going on. We also get another very interesting and kind of definitive thing from Agatha here, which is she says that the Infinity Stone amplified what otherwise would have died on the vine. And this is her really pushing, finally, very hard to the fact that Wanda had powers. Wanda had abilities of some sort. They were not abilities that she was really conscious of. They were not abilities that would have manifested if she had been left to her own devices. But the exposure to the Infinity Stone has awakened those abilities, and she now appears to be a very powerful being, not just from this thing that originated from the cosmos, but also something that originated from inside her. Wanda's having a pretty tough afternoon, because after visiting those two painful experiences, she now goes to the Avengers compound. This is obviously sometime around Civil War, obviously a little bit before that movie, She's still grieving the death of her brother, and we see Vision come in. Wanda is watching another sitcom. She's watching Malcolm in the Middle with the great Bryan Cranston, and Wanda and Vision have a really great conversation, and this was some really good writing. I mean, there have been a lot of great scenes between those two, but you have these two that are still kind of getting to know each other, and Wanda saying that she gets hit by these waves of grief, and they knock her down, and she tries to get up, and she just gets knocked down again, and she doesn't know if she'll ever be able to get over it. And Vision says this line that is such a beautifully well-written line, which is, "What is grief if not love persevering?" I think that's just so beautifully put, and you can see why Wanda and Vision were so drawn to each other, and particularly why Vision was so important to Wanda as the Vision, as being outside of humanity. In a weird way, he had razor sharp insights into this emotionality, because it's something that he wasn't clouded by or blinded by. He was able to see things so impassively, and you see why they were such a great match and so good for each other. And it was a very simple scene. It was one that could have just been kind of a filler scene, and you could just write some trite cliche dialogue to show why they were important from each other. But I think this was maybe one of the more important scenes in the entire show, and it was just a well-crafted, wonderfully acted, beautifully written scene. Wanda is very near her breaking point, which is exactly where Agatha wants her, because she needs Wanda to let these defenses down, because she wants Wanda to show her how she got to this place where she was capable of creating Westview. So we now go to Sword, and this is almost like I'm not going to say Rashomon, because this was an unreliable narrator. Earlier in the season, Hayward showed this security video and said that Wanda had come to Sword, had stolen Vision's body, and they had to get into Westview to figure out what was going on, because she stole this very important piece of weaponry. Well, it turns out, surprise, surprise, Hayward's not exactly the most reliable person, because we do see Wanda show up at Sword. It's very shortly after the blip. We see the news reels going up and celebrating that people have come back. Wanda talks about the fact that she blipped back and Vision's body was gone. I mean, that's true. Wanda would have just blipped back into Wakanda. No Vision, didn't know where he was, shows up at Sword and basically says like, hey, I loved this guy. You have his body here. Like, can I bury him? Can I give him a funeral? He deserves that. And Hayward is like the most heartless, like, first of all, any human, any person, but like particularly somebody who is capable of doing what Wanda's capable of, don't go from, oh, I'm sorry that your loved one died, to, do you want to see the Vision chop shop that I have out here behind my office? Like, this is a self-inflicted wound from Hayward. You should at least set up what's going on before just being like, oh yeah, take a look out back. We got him in pieces back there. You think that we're building up to events that we already know what's going to happen. Wanda breaks the glass. She goes down into the lab. You think that she's about to grab the body, but instead she goes to Vision. She puts her hand on his head and kind of feels around with her powers, with her magic, and essentially says, I can't feel you. I can't sense you. You're not here. It's this finality in a way of realizing that this is a body. This is not Vision, and it's not going to be Vision. And then she just leaves and leaves Vision's body there. And when she walked out into the parking lot, I was like, okay, well, what makes her go back inside? Because we know that she stole Vision's body. She did not steal Vision's body, as we will find out later on. This is Hayward's big move. This is exactly what he's been trying to do. And now we start to understand what this little creepy, sneaky effer's been doing the entire season. Instead, we follow Wanda as she drives to New Jersey. She drives to Westview. She's driving around the town, and she improved this town. Let's be honest. Westview was no paradise. It was a very sad-looking town. It had obviously been hit hard by any number of depressions. The townspeople don't look very happy. And at first, I was just like, why is Wanda driving around here? Like, is she just looking to blow off some steam? Then she pulls into a driveway. She walks out into an empty lot, and she opens a folder, and we find out that Vision had actually bought a lot in Westview for the two of them, for them to build a home, and as the note says, for them to grow old together. And I mean, this is just a gut punch to find out that the reason that she's in this town in New Jersey is because this is where they were going to start their life. This is where they were going to build their life. This is Wanda at her lowest, and we do finally see this volcanic eruption that happened inside of her that led to her building the Hex. It just literally explodes out of her. We see that this huge cloud of magic comes out of her. She constructs the house in Westview that we've seen throughout the series of the show, and then this just burst of it comes out, and we see the rest of the Hex being created. We see the town square becoming the 1950s town square, the black and white set that we'd already seen. We see the creation of this world that started in episode 1. And then what I really liked was that they differentiated the kind of magic. There's a yellow cloud that's coming out to create Vision. But this confirms again, this is one of the big answers that we got. The Vision that we're seeing in this show is not Vision. It is not his actual body. This version is also derived from the Mind Stone, but we get that confirmation that this is not actually Vision. This is another creation, another fabrication of Wanda's. And we really come full circle. We're back in episode 1. Vision welcomes Wanda home. We see Wanda become that 1950s black and white housewife. They sit down on the couch together, but now we realize that this is not really reality. We are in Wanda's memory. We see Wanda looking on in color, and then we cut to the fact that we are still in Agatha's world. We're on a sound stage, which contains the set that they were using for that episode, and I'm sure it was probably the actual set that they were using to film those particular episodes. And Agatha finally has her answer. She sees now what Wanda is capable of and how she was able to do what she did. Agatha disappears. Wanda hears her kids calling from outside. She runs back out. She goes into the street, only to find that Agatha has Billy and Tommy by their necks. I mean, she is really sadistic out in the street. And I love that Wanda is still protective of these kids, even though she has to know at this point, having just seen what she saw, that they are fabrications. She still loves them because in her mind, they are still her kids. But Agatha's got other plans because she understands just what's going on with Wanda here. This is also where Agatha goes a lot deeper into Marvel lore than I'm familiar with. I've heard the term chaos magic a few times in my life as a comic book fan. Again, not a deep dive comic book fan. I know a lot about some comics, but not about all of them. But she says basically, I know what's going on here. You've used chaos magic. You're the Scarlet Witch. And this was a drop where we realized that the Scarlet Witch is not just some name that got carried over from the comic books. This is a real, actual entity. Agatha says that you're supposed to be a myth, that you're a being capable of spontaneous creation. I love the line where she said, here you are making breakfast for dinner, this kind of dismissive thing that Agatha has been searching for this kind of power her whole life, and she finds it, and this person is, in her mind, using it for these small purposes of just trying to get over her own personal grief. There are obviously much bigger implications for what Wanda's power is and how it can be used. How much of it are we going to see next week? How much of it is it going to go further into the Marvel Cinematic Universe? We don't know quite yet. But of course, there is one last thing in store, and it's a big one. After we get that Scarlet Witch name drop, we have some credits, and then we are back outside the Hex. We're there with Hayward, who I hate even more now. And he has now figured out a huge part of the puzzle because the drone that Wanda brought back out of the Hex several episodes ago still has some of her magic imbued inside of it. Hayward has been able to harness that energy, and he indeed does still have Vision's body. He has reassembled it, and he revives Vision, except he's not quite the Vision that we know. And again, I know I've seen this version in various iterations throughout the comic books. I would encourage you to seek out if you so desire. Again, so many other people that are doing a lot of great work and going deep dives into the past, into the comic book lore about the particular history behind this version of the character. Go crazy. I love that everybody can look at things from a different way, but this is where we leave it. And the one thing that I will say is that when we look at the flow of the show, we have left a lot of work to be done next week for the finale. There are, just plot-wise, there's so many things that you have to do if you're going to resolve so much of what's going on. You've got Pietro, you've got Monica Rambeau, you've got Hayward, you've got Wanda, you've got Vision, Agatha, the kids. There's so many different things that are going to have to be addressed. I think we're going to find out, is this going to be left as an open-ended TV show? Are they going to resolve some of the storylines and punt the other ones into other Marvel movies? I think the answers to a lot lot of those questions are going to determine my ultimate feelings about the show, although I'm pretty positive about almost everything that they've done so far. The one thing I am pretty confident in saying, though, is that no matter how they wrap up or resolve everything next week, this really was a standout episode, if only because we find out so much about Wanda's backstory, and also because, like I said, it was so well written, and just seeing that scene between Wanda and Vision, seeing these interactions and knowing about how she bonded with her parents, it gives you so much great information, background information about a character that we didn't know much about. Yes, that did spend a lot of time on things that we did already know about, but I think it also sheds some new light on those things. And ultimately, when we take the big bird's eye view and we look at WandaVision, I think that a lot of people are going to point to this episode as perhaps the show's finest moment. Definitely one of the best, if not the best episodes of the season so far. So we've got one episode of WandaVision left. What do you think is going to happen? What are your predictions? There were some big bads that were predicted that people thought might get dropped this episode. No sign yet. Do you think that there's still some stuff to come? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. If you want to know what else I'm up to, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. And I especially want to thank these patrons. These are some of my producer level patrons. We are wrapping up the month. We've got Movie Club. They just got a producer exclusive commentary. We have a great time over on Patreon. No matter what level you join at, I would love for you to come and join me. And please don't forget about my podcast, All My Movies, which airs every week on the Schmodown Entertainment Network and as an audio podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you like to find your podcasts. Thank you so much for watching this breakdown of WandaVision. I will see you back here next week for the season finale. What will we know? What will we not know? We'll find out then. Thanks for watching.